Hi boys and girls, my name is Nancy Strickland and I'm a teacher at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. And in a few days you'll be visiting the Amon Carter Museum via video conference, and we'll have a conversation about something that you have been or will be talking about in your science class. We'll be talking about biomes. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But first, I kind of want to introduce you to the idea of how science and art are connected, how they're similar to each other. And then we're going to talk about a very special scientist, artist, he did both things, who took photographs. And it's those photographs that we'll use later to have our conversation about biomes. But let's think first about how art and science are connected. Science and art really naturally overlap. They're both a means of investigation. They both involve ideas. They involve forming theories or setting forth a hypothesis that you test in a laboratory for a scientist or in a studio for an artist. Artists, like scientists, learn to transform information into something else. They make paint and a canvas become a picture. Scientists, on the other hand, will transform information that they're collecting in the lab to solve a problem, like creating the cure for a disease or something like that. So, since the beginning of time, they've been very connected and interrelated to each other. Think for a few minutes about the things that artists and scientists do. In a moment, I'll show you a slide that lists those things, but I want you to think about it. Think about a scientist in a laboratory or yourself doing an experiment in your science classroom, and then think about an artist in his studio doing something in a way that perhaps he's never done before. They're both very keen on observation, so they both make close observations. That's the first thing on our slide here. The second thing would be to form a hypothesis. They both do that. Maybe in a more formal way for a scientist, but actually even an artist will put forth an idea and try to prove that idea to be true or not true. They both experiment and investigate. They both solve problems. And of course, scientists and artists are both very creative. Now, look at this slide. I bet you know this painting. It's not in our museum here at the Amon Carter Museum. This is in the Louvre in Paris, France. You're right, it's the Mona Lisa. And now think about, who's the artist of the Mona Lisa? Some of you are probably saying Leonardo da Vinci. You're right, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa about 500 years ago in Italy. And he was probably one of the greatest examples of an artist and a scientist. He was a great artist, but an incredible inventor and scientist as well. The drawings that you see on the right side of this slide are examples of some of the work that he did and the talent that he had to study something. And that work and that talent that he had helped him to become a better artist as well. The picture that you see on the top there, of course, is studying the human hand, and we'll look at some of those others when we get back together for our video conference. But he was fantastic at studying the inside of the human body and animals as well as the outside. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci was among the first men to ever dissect the human body. And he did that in order to understand it better and in order to duplicate it better in his art. Now take a look at this slide. This is Elliot Porter, and you can see his life dates there beside him. He was born in 1901 and he lived to 1990. So he's no longer living. He's been gone more than 20 years, but is still considered a pretty contemporary artist. And if you look closely in his hands, you'll recognize that as a camera. It's called a field camera, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But he used a camera to capture images of the world rather than a paintbrush or sculpting. Now here's some photographs, or one photograph of Elliot Porter on the left there. He was about 9 years old in that photograph, and he always had this fantastic interest in both science and art, was particularly interested in photography. And when he was about 11 years old, his family gave him, you can see it in the picture and I'm showing it to you here, this is called a Brownie camera. And it's actually relatively small for the cameras at the time, and it was very inexpensive. It's made of cardboard and paper, and there are lenses here. You look down into the camera like this to take a picture. And at 11, he was given the camera and immediately gained a love of photographing nature and traveled all around his neighborhood and an island that the family visited sometimes. He and his friend would take pictures with the Brownie camera, pictures of things in nature. He also had this interest in science, and you can see from the photograph there on the right, that's not Elliot Porter, that's another little boy, but he has a chemistry set. And that was something that was very popular when Elliot Porter was a little boy, to work with those chemicals, put things together, and see how chemicals reacted with each other. That instilled in him a love of science as well. And in fact, Elliot Porter grew up to go to college and become a medical doctor as well as a scientist. And the thing that he was studying the most was small microscopic living organisms. He was called it was bacteriology was what he studied. And it's related to medicine and industry and agriculture. And as an adult, he did that for years, always taking pictures though on the side, his hobby. And remember we talked about how artists and scientists were problem solvers. And Elliot Porter was a problem solver as well. And you can see the picture of him here using a lens to get very close shots of that moss on the rocks that he's looking at there. And you can see him here on the left setting up a strobe light. It was Elliot Porter who figured out that a strobe light could be set up in order to capture with a camera the flight of a bird without it looking too blurry. That light flashing off and on helped him to solve that problem of getting a picture, and that's one of his photographs on the right there, of a bird in flight. Now take a look at this, and let's think about this and look at it through the lens of both an artist and a scientist. So artists are concerned about elements of art, things like color and line and form and shape and texture. So I want you to pause the video for just a minute, and with your teacher, I want you to think about the types of lines, the shades of the blues and blacks and whites that you see there, any forms that you see. Think about it as an artist would. So you've had a few minutes to think about it as an artist. Now let's think about it as a scientist. Think about, if you saw that as a scientist, what kinds of questions that you might have about this thing or this place. I'll let you think about that for a few minutes. I wonder how this place was formed and how old it is. And are there any living things in this place? And then the question I have the most about this place as a scientist is, why does it look so blue? I'm sure many of you have guessed that it's ice. And when we come back together during the video conference, I'll quickly tell you where this ice cave is, and we'll talk a bit about why it looks so blue. Here's another one for you to look at. This is a photograph by Elliot Porter in a place in New Mexico that's called the Black Place. I want you to think about this as an artist, line, shape, form, color, and then think about it as a scientist. You would be interested in the place from both of those points of view. And then finally, I'll show you the work of another artist. This is a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. She painted that same place The slide you saw, the black place in New Mexico, she painted it many times. This one's titled Dark Mesa Pink Sky. And it's her interpretation of what that same landform looks like. This is a photograph of Elliott Porter and his friend, Georgia O'Keeffe. They were, in fact, friends. And by the time Elliott Porter had spent many years working as a research scientist and as an artist, he began to be accepted as an important fine arts artist. And by that I mean that his work was seen as beautiful and accomplished enough to be purchased and hung in museums and to be sold in galleries and so forth. And so he eventually stopped working as a scientist and became a photographer and an artist full-time. And one of the things that he did with his art was show that color photography could be as accepted as fine art as black and white. Before Elliott Porter's time, photographers only worked with black and white film, and they thought that was artistic. But Elliott Porter proved them wrong and showed that color photography could be just as artistic as the black and white. Another thing that he did, and you can see him in a place called Glen Canyon, Utah here, and then this slide is one of the pictures that he took in Glen Canyon, Utah. He was an environmentalist as well. He was very concerned about conservation and saving beautiful places on our planet. And so he took it upon himself to take pictures, and I'm showing you here a book that Elliott Porter wrote, even as an older gentleman, that's called The Place That No One Knew. This was one of his first books. And he wrote it about Glen Canyon and trying to show people the beauty of the place. He was trying to prevent the building of a large dam on the river, on the Colorado River, which would flood Glen Canyon and lose this beautiful landscape forever. He didn't prevent the building of the dam, and there are reasons why the dam was important as well. But he did capture the beauty of that place before it was lost forever. He published the book, and I want you to think about he included in the book the writings of others to describe the beauty of the place. So as you're looking at this photograph of Glen Canyon, think about this. The finest workers in stone are not copper and steel tools, but the gentle touch of air and water working at their leisure with a liberal allowance of time. He's talking about that beauty that's created by erosion from the air and water, creating a beautiful place like Glen Canyon or the Grand Canyon, which is very near that. You see him with a view camera here, and this is a picture of Elliott Porter in 1980. And actually by 1980, we had cameras that were much more compact, but they didn't take a picture as sharply, and they didn't show colors as vividly as Elliott Porter was able to show with his view camera. In fact, he used a particular photographic process that I'll show you a little bit of a little bit more about when we have our video conference together, that was able to capture those beautiful, vivid colors. Now, when we come back together, most of our time will be spent in talking about biomes, because this is your science class after all. So we're going to use those pictures that Elliott Porter took to have our conversation about various biomes of the world. And by the way, scientists classify things in order to help us understand them better, to help us organize them in our minds. And the classification of biomes varies between scientists. So we'll talk about 5 different biomes in our program. Your textbook that you're using may classify biomes in a slightly different way. But the definition of a biome is that it is a large geographic area. It has distinctive plant and animal life, which are adapted to that particular area. So it's a large area, distinctive plant and animals, and those plants and animals make adaptation in order to survive in that area. And within that area, it's things such as the climate and the geography of the region that determine the type of biome that exists there. And within that climate, you know, we're talking about things like temperature, the amount of light, and the amount of precipitation or water. And within the geography, we're talking about the soil and also the landforms that are within the area. So after this program, boys and girls, and before we get back together, you'll be looking at some photographs of Elliott Porter, and you'll be looking at some definitions of those 5 biomes and doing an activity as a group to classify those pictures according to what biome they are. One last thing that I want to point out before we get back together is the difference between an ecosystem and a biome. And your teacher may want to be talking with you about this a little bit more before we get back together. There are many different ecosystems within every biome. So an ecosystem is kind of the intersection between the living and the non-living things within a certain environment. So think about the forest biome, for example. In the forest biome, we have the canopy, that would be all the tree limbs, the leaves, and the things that are up in the air, and then we have the forest floor. Those are 2 different ecosystems within that forest biome. So just another thing to think about, and we'll talk about that some more as we get back together. I'll see you in a few days.